Hello, my friend. Today I bring you another lost legend from the depths of Middle-earth. Close your eyes, feel the magic surround you. Our journey begins.
Why the Eagles Never Helped More in the War, an epic of ancient oaths and forgotten guardians. Section 1. Shadowed Beginnings. In the deepest hours before dawn, when even the stars seemed to hold their breath, Arion the Grey walked the ancient paths beneath the Thornspire Mountains. His staff clicked against stones worn smooth by countless ages, each step echoing in the vast silence that had settled over the forgotten halls like a shroud of mourning. The wind that had once carried the great Skylords in their proud flights between the peaks now whispered only of old grievances and broken trust. High above, the areas of the Stormwind clan remained occupied, yet distant, as if a great chasm had opened not in the stone, but in the very heart of Alliance itself. Arion paused beside a weathered monument, its carved runes speaking of treaties written in starlight and oaths sworn beneath the first moon. Here, in ages past, the Skylords had pledged their wings to the free peoples in their darkest hour. Yet when the shadow had last stirred in earnest, when the very foundations of the world had trembled beneath the weight of ancient malice, those same wings had remained folded. The wizard's grey eyes, deep as mountain pools, reflected the pain of that absence. Not betrayal, for the Skylords were noble beyond the reach of such base thoughts, but something far more complex. A wound that had festered in the high places, where the wind sang lonesome songs of duty, abandoned and oaths grown cold. For Arion knew what the chroniclers would never write, what the bards would never sing, that in the great war against the Dark Lord Morghast, when all seemed lost and the very light of the world flickered like a dying candle, the Skylords had not merely chosen to remain aloof. They had been bound by chains far stronger than iron, chains forged of ancient pride, bitter memory, and a debt of blood that even their noble hearts could not forget. The first stirrings of that darkness had begun not in the Black Tower of Gormund, where Morghast wreathed himself in shadow and flame, but here, in these very halls where treaty stones lay cracked and the wind moaned through empty corridors. It had begun with a single act of betrayal, a moment when trust was shattered like glass upon stone, and the Sky Children had withdrawn their protection from the earthbound folk forever. Or so it had seemed. For Arion carried within his heart an ember of hope, faint but persistent, that perhaps the ancient wound might yet be healed, and the wings of storm might once more shadow the lands in protection rather than absence. Section 2. A Whisper in the Trees. 3 days' journey from the mountain halls, the forest of Silverleaf stretched like a sea of green memory beneath the morning sun. Here, where the oldest oaks remembered the first songs ever sung, Arion sought counsel from those who had witnessed the beginning of the rift between earth and sky. The Entlords of this wood were ancient beyond the reckoning of mortal years, their bark-wreathed faces bearing the wisdom of countless seasons. Thornheart the eldest stood among his grove like a pillar of living time, his voice the rustle of autumn leaves when at last he spoke. "Whom, Grey Walker?" the deep voice rumbled like distant thunder. "Long have we waited for one to ask the questions that burn unspoken in the hearts of the young races. You seek the truth of the Skylord's silence, do you not?" Arion bowed his head in reverence. "The wound grows deeper with each passing age, Ancient One. Soon, the memory of their alliance will fade to legend, and legend to myth. If understanding is to be found, it must be now." Thornheart's great eyes, like pools of amber sap, seemed to look through countless years. "Then hear and remember. For this tale begins not with treachery, but with love, and love's betrayal cuts deepest of all wounds." The Ent's voice took on the cadence of old songs, half-remembered lullabies that had once soothed the world to sleep in gentler days. In the second age of stars, when the realm of Astoria flourished beneath the protection of both earth and sky, there came a time of such beauty that even we, who have seen the turning of 10,000 seasons, wept for joy. As Thornheart spoke, other Ents gathered in the grove, Birchsong the swift, whose golden leaves trembled with each word, Ironbough the steadfast, scarred by lightning but unbroken, and ancient Willowmere, whose tears had fed the streams for 1,000 years. They formed a circle of living memory, each adding their voice to the tale. The Skylord Galathon, mightiest of the Stormwing clan, had taken to wife the Princess Melania of Astoria, Thornheart continued. Never had such joy been seen in either realm, the union of wind and earth, of freedom and stability. Their love was celebrated in songs that reached from the deepest roots to the highest peaks. But even as the ancient words painted pictures of joy, Arion sensed the shadow that would fall, for all tales of such beauty carried within them the seeds of their own sorrow. Section 3. The Lone Rider. From the Forest of Memory, Arion turned his path eastward, toward the sundering pass where the mountains cleft like a wound in the world's side. His horse, Shadowmere, picked her way carefully along the narrow ledges, her grey coat mirroring the stone around them. The wind here carried whispers of older times, and sometimes, if he listened closely, the echo of great wings. As they climbed through the thin air of the high places, the wizard's mind turned over Thornheart's words like precious stones. Love and betrayal, always the roots of the deepest wounds. But what manner of betrayal could have turned the noble Skylords from their ancient oaths? The pass itself was a place of pilgrimage for those who sought to understand the sundered alliance. Here, carved into the living rock by the Skylords themselves, stood the monument of first meeting, a great arch where earth and sky touched, decorated with reliefs showing the winged ones and the ground folk in harmony. But the carvings told a story that few now remembered how to read. Arion dismounted and approached the ancient stone with reverent steps. His fingers traced the weathered symbols, each one a word in the sky speech that had not been heard in the lower airs for nigh on 1,000 years. The first panel showed the Skylords in their glory, magnificent beings with wings like storm clouds and eyes like lightning. They soared above cities of white stone, their shadows bringing not fear but protection. In their talons they carried not weapons but olive branches and scrolls of treaty. The second panel depicted the Great Alliance. Here, the kings of Earth knelt not in subjugation but in partnership, their crowns touching the clawed feet of the Skylords in gestures of mutual respect. Above them all, the symbols of sun and moon intertwined, showing that this bond was blessed by the very powers that governed the turning of the world. But it was the third panel that made Arion's heart heavy with understanding. Here the harmony was broken. The Skylords flew not in formation but scattered, their wings torn and bloodied. Below, the cities burned, and tiny figures fled in terror. In the centre of the chaos, two forms grappled, one winged, one earthbound, locked in deadly combat. Here began the sundering, Arion whispered, his words lost in the mountain wind. But what drove them to such desperation? As if in answer, a shadow passed overhead. Looking up, Arion saw a lone Skylord circling high above, too distant to make out clearly but unmistakably watching. For a moment their eyes met across the vast gulf of air and years, and in that gaze Arion read such sorrow that his own heart nearly broke. Then the great bird turned and disappeared into the endless blue, leaving only questions and the ache of loss. Section 4. Dol Morgul in the distance. The eastern slopes of the Thornspire range gave way to a blasted heath, where no green thing grew. Here, like a canker upon the face of the world, rose the dark fortress of Dol Morgul, the hill of black sorcery. From this vantage point, still a day's hard ride from its walls, the tower seemed to pulse with malevolent life, as if the very stones were infected with hatred. Arion drew his cloak closer about him, though the chill that touched his bones came not from any earthly wind. This was the seat of Morghast's power, the place where the Dark Lord had first begun to weave his web of corruption that would eventually engulf half the world. But more than that, this was where the final betrayal had been enacted, where the ancient alliance had died in blood and shadow. Shadowmere whickered nervously, her hooves dancing on the blackened stone. Even the animals knew that this was a place where the natural order had been twisted beyond recognition. The very air tasted of sulphur and despair, and overhead no birds flew. Not even the carrion crows that haunted battlefields dared venture into these skies. Yet Arion pressed forward, for he carried within his staff a light that no darkness could entirely quench. As they drew nearer to the accursed hill, details of the fortress became clearer. The walls were built not of hewn stone, but of bones, the bones of giants and dragons and other creatures of legend, fused together by dark sorcery into a mockery of architecture. Atop the highest tower, a red flame burned with cold fire, casting shadows that moved against the natural law. And sometimes, just at the edge of vision, great shapes could be seen circling that flame, but these were not the noble skylords of old. These wings were tattered and black, corrupted by the same evil that had built this place. The fell drakes, Arion murmured, naming the abominations that served as Morghast's aerial forces. Once, perhaps, they too had been noble, lesser cousins to the Skylords, creatures of wind and storm. But they had been twisted by the Dark Lord's malice into things of shadow and flame, their songs become screams, their protection become predation. It was here, in the shadow of Dol Morgul, that the truth of the Sundering had been written in blood. Here that Princess Malenia had been brought in chains, her marriage to Galithon turned into a weapon against her own people. Here that the Skylords had been forced to choose between their oaths to protect the innocent and their love for one who'd been made complicit in darkness. The wind from the fortress carried whispers in the black speech, promises of power and threats of doom. But underneath those evil voices, Arion thought he could hear something else, the faint echo of a song of mourning, sung in the sky speech by voices that had not forgotten love, even in their corruption. As he made camp at the edge of the Blight, far enough from the fortress to escape its most immediate malice, but close enough to feel its presence like a weight upon his soul, Arion gazed up at the star-swept sky. Somewhere beyond those distant lights, he knew the true Skylords still flew their ancient patterns, bound by oaths older than kingdoms, carrying burdens that no earthbound heart could fully comprehend. Tomorrow, he would seek the entrance to the Sundering Halls, the underground chambers where the last free Skylords had hidden during the siege of Dol Morgul. There, if the old songs were true, lay the key to understanding, and perhaps the hope of healing. Section 5. Into the Black. The entrance to the Sundering Halls lay hidden beneath a cairn of black stones, marked only by a single white feather that had somehow resisted the corruption of centuries. Arion approached with reverence, knowing that he walked in the footsteps of heroes and martyrs, of those who had paid the ultimate price for their refusal to bend the knee to darkness. The passage sloped downward into the heart of the hill, lit only by the pale light of his staff. The walls were carved from living rock, but unlike the grand halls of the dwarven kingdoms, these tunnels spoke of desperate haste and grim purpose. Tool marks showed where the Skylords had worked alongside their earthbound allies to carve a sanctuary that would outlast the siege above. As he descended, the oppressive weight of Dol Morgul seemed to increase, pressing down upon his shoulders like a physical thing. The very air grew thick and hard to breathe, tainted with the memory of ancient fear. Yet there was something else here too, a stubborn defiance that had not been broken even by centuries of shadow. The first chamber he entered took his breath away. The walls were covered in murals that put even the monument of first meeting to shame, but these depicted not triumph, but tragedy. Here was the story of the Sundering told in images of heartbreaking beauty and terrible sorrow. The central scene showed Princess Malenia chained to the tower of Dol Morgul, her face turned skyward in desperate appeal. Above her, the Skylords circled in anguish, their formation broken by grief. At their head flew Galithon, his mighty wings bearing wounds that bled starlight, his cry of anguish captured forever in stone. She was not willing, Arion whispered, understanding flooding through him like ice water. She was taken against her will, used as bait to draw the Skylords into Morghast's trap. The next panel showed the terrible choice that had faced the Winged Ones. To rescue Malenia, they would have to assault Dol Morgul directly, but the fortress was guarded by trebuchets loaded with cursed chains, weapons specifically designed to bring down flying creatures. Any attack would cost countless Skylord lives with no guarantee of success. But the alternative was to abandon her to her fate, to let Morghast corrupt her as he had corrupted so many others, turning her into a weapon against her own people. For the Dark Lord's plan had been subtle and cruel, to force the Skylords to watch as their beloved princess was slowly transformed into one of his servants. Her love turned to hatred, her songs to screams. In the final panel, Arion saw the choice they had made. Galathan flew alone against the fortress, not in attack but in surrender. He offered himself in exchange for Melania's freedom, a bargain that Morghast had accepted with glee, for the capture of the greatest of the Sky Lords was worth more than 100 princesses. But as Arion studied the ancient art more closely, he saw something the casual observer would miss. In Galethan's talon, barely visible against the stone, was clutched a small object, a ring of white gold that glowed with its own inner light, and on Melania's face, instead of relief at her rescue, was written an expression of terrible understanding. For she knew, as did he, that Galathan's sacrifice had doomed them both. Morghast would corrupt the noble Sky Lord into one of his Feldrakes, and use him to lead attacks against the very people he had sworn to protect. The sight of their greatest champion turned against them would break the spirit of the earthbound folk more surely than any army. In the crushing silence of the sundering halls, Arion finally understood why the Sky Lords had withdrawn from the affairs of the ground dwellers. It was not pride or indifference that kept them aloft. It was the knowledge that their very presence brought danger to those they loved. Section 6. The captive king deeper in the halls, beyond chambers filled with the artifacts of a lost alliance, Arion came upon a sight that stopped him cold. In a circular room carved from pure white stone, bound by chains of starlight that still held their glow after all these years, sat a figure of impossible majesty and infinite sorrow. This was Galathan himself, or what remained of him. The great Sky Lord had been beautiful once, terrible in his glory, with wings that could weather any storm and eyes that held the lightning's fire. But centuries of captivity had changed him. His feathers had turned from silver to grey, and many had fallen out entirely, leaving bare patches of scarred skin. His eyes, once bright as stars, now held depths of pain that no mortal mind could fully grasp. Yet still he was magnificent, still unmistakably noble despite his suffering. When he raised his head to look upon his visitor, Arion felt the full weight of that ancient dignity, and he bowed low in respect. "Rise, little wizard," Galathan's voice was like wind through mountain passes, beautiful and terrible at once. "I have been waiting long for one such as you to find this place. The others who come here seek only treasure or power. They never think to look in the Chamber of Shadows." "My lord Galathan," Arion said, his voice thick with emotion, "all the world believes you are corrupted, transformed into one of Morghast's servants. How do you come to be here, in chains but uncorrupted?" A sound that might have been laughter, if laughter could hold such bitterness, escaped the Sky Lord's throat. "Corrupted? Perhaps I am, little friend. Perhaps corruption comes in forms more subtle than the black fires of Dol Morgul. Tell me, what is corruption, if not the betrayal of one's deepest nature?" The great head bowed under some invisible weight. "I am the king who could not protect his people, the husband who could not save his wife, the warrior who chose chains over battle, captivity over the chance, however slim, of victory. If that is not corruption, what is?" "You saved her," Arion protested. "Princess Melania was freed." "Was she?" Galathan's eyes blazed suddenly with their old fire. "Look again at the murals, wise one. Look more closely at what you thought you saw." And Arion did look, with eyes now opened by the Sky Lord's words. In the final panel, he saw what he had missed before. Melania's face held not relief, but horror. Not at her captivity, but at Galathan's sacrifice. Her hands were reaching not toward freedom, but back toward the fortress, toward the beloved who had damned himself for her sake. "She chose to return," Arion whispered, understanding at last. "She could not bear to be free while you suffered." "She returned to the tower of her own will," Galathan confirmed. "And Morghast, who had expected to hold one of us as hostage, found himself with 2 willing prisoners. For what torture could he devise that was worse than separation? What corruption more complete than love turned into a weapon against itself?" The chains that bound the Sky Lord clinked softly as he shifted, and Arion saw that they were inscribed with runes of binding, not dark sorcery, but the ancient magic of willing sacrifice. These bonds had not been forged by Morghast, but by Galathan himself, as a voluntary penance for his failure to find another way. "And so we remain," the Sky Lord continued. "She in her tower, I in my chains, both of us alive but neither truly free. And our people, both skyborn and earthbound, pay the price of our failure. For as long as we linger in captivity, as long as the greatest love story of the Second Age remains unresolved, the alliance between earth and sky cannot be renewed. In that moment, Arion understood the true tragedy of the Sundering. It was not merely a political break or a failure of treaty. It was a wound in the very heart of the world, a love story interrupted by malice and left hanging like a broken song. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was still hope for an ending. Section 7. The Necromancer's Voice. As Arion stood in the presence of the captive Skylord, the very air in the chamber began to thicken with an oppressive malevolence. The white stones grew cold, and shadows gathered in corners where no shadows should be. From somewhere far above, a voice began to speak, not heard with the ears but felt in the bones and soul. "So," the voice purred with mock sweetness, "another seeker has found his way to my collection. How delightful. It has been so long since I had a new plaything." Morghast. Even after all these centuries, even with his physical form destroyed in the War of the Last Alliance, his spirit lingered, bound to this place by the very chains he had forged around the hearts of his captives. Galathon's eyes flashed with protective fire. "Begone, Shadow. This one is under my protection." "Your protection?" The laugh that echoed through the chamber was like the sound of breaking glass. "You, who could not protect your own beloved. You, who gave yourself into my hands like a lamb to slaughter. What protection can you offer now, Sky King?" The shadows in the corners began to move, taking shape, but these were not the crude horrors that lesser necromancers summoned. These were memories given form, scenes from the past twisted into weapons of despair. Arion saw himself as he might become, old beyond his years, driven mad by the weight of knowledge, friendless and alone because he had learned too much of the darkness in the world. He saw the alliance he sought to heal crumbling further, the Skylords withdrawing so far from earthbound affairs that they became mere legend, then myth, then nothing at all. "You see?" Morghast's voice was honey over poison. "I offer him the same choice I gave you, proud Galathon. He can turn away now, forget what he has learned, live out his days in ignorance and false peace, or he can continue on his path and learn the truth that some wounds are too deep to heal, some loves too pure to exist in a corrupted world." But Galathon rose as much as his chains would allow, and his voice rang out with the authority of thunder. "Little wizard, hear me well. This creature speaks in truths twisted to serve lies. Yes, the wound is deep, but wounds can heal. Yes, love can be corrupted, but it can also redeem. Do not let his despair become yours." The shadows pressed closer, and now Arion could see among them the forms of other seekers who had come before him. Brave knights and wise counsellors, poets and prophets, all who had tried to understand the Sundering and been broken by the knowledge. "They all thought as you do," Morghast whispered. "They all believed that understanding would lead to healing, but look at them now, mad or dead or worse, all of them. Turn back, little wizard. Some stones are better left unturned." But in that moment of deepest despair, Arion remembered something the Entlord Thornheart had said, that the tale began not with treachery, but with love, and love, once kindled, could not be entirely extinguished, not even by centuries of shadow. Drawing upon his staff's light, he spoke words of power that had not been heard in these halls since their making. The shadows recoiled, and Morghast's laughter faltered. "I have seen the murals, Shadow Speaker," Arion declared. "I have heard the true story. Your victory was not as complete as you pretend. Love endures, even here in your stronghold, and where love endures, there is always hope." The necromancer's voice rose to a shriek of rage, but already the shadows were fading. For all his power, Morghast was a spirit of despair, and he could not long maintain his presence in the face of genuine hope. As the darkness receded, Galathon looked upon Arion with something approaching wonder. It has been long since anyone spoke so boldly in these halls. Perhaps there is still a path forward after all. Section 8. Fire in the Darkness. In the wake of Morghast's retreat, the Sundering halls seemed different, not warm, but no longer utterly cold. The oppressive weight that had pressed upon Arion's shoulders lifted slightly, as if the very stones had been holding their breath and could now release it. Galathon studied the wizard with new interest. his ancient eyes reading depth that few mortals possessed. "You carry more than a staff of power, little friend. There is something else, a light that does not come from crystal or spell. What is it that shields you from the despair that has claimed so many others?" Arion was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "I have seen the ending of the song, my lord. Not this song, that remains unfinished, but I have glimpsed what lies beyond, in the music that encompasses all tales. And in that music, no theme is ever truly lost, only transformed, woven into something greater than it was before." From somewhere deep within his robes, Arion drew forth an object that made Galathan's breath catch in surprise. It was a feather, but not just any feather. This one gleamed with inner light, white as starlight but warm as sunshine, and it hummed with a music just at the edge of hearing. "The feather of first flight," the Sky Lord whispered. "But that was lost when Princess Melania was first taken," Arion confirmed. "She dropped it as she was carried away, and it fell to earth in the gardens of Astoria. It has been kept safe all these years by those who still believe in the old alliance passed from guardian to guardian, waiting for the moment when it might be needed again." The feather's light grew brighter as Arion held it up, and for the first time in centuries Galathan's chains began to sing, not with the sound of binding but with something approaching harmony. The runes inscribed upon them flickered, as if struggling between their original purpose and some new possibility. "What are you saying, wizard?" Galathan's voice held a note that had not been heard in an age. Hope, fragile but real. "I am saying that the song is not over, that love, once truly given, cannot be destroyed, only changed. Your sacrifice was not in vain, nor was hers, but it was never meant to be the ending." Arion stepped closer to the chained Sky Lord, the feather's light now bright enough to illuminate the entire chamber. "You bound yourself with chains of guilt and failure." She bound herself to a tower of despair and self-sacrifice. "But neither guilt nor despair are the truth of what you are to each other." The feather began to pulse in rhythm with some cosmic heartbeat, and the runes on Galathan's chains pulsed in response. But more than that, from somewhere far above, echoing down through stone and shadow, came the sound of another voice singing. Sweet and clear and filled with longing, it was a melody that Galathan had not heard for 1,000 years. "Melania," he breathed, and the name was a prayer on his lips. "She has been singing," Arion explained gently. "All this time, every day since your capture, she has sung the songs of your people from her tower, not in despair, but in remembrance, not in captivity, but in keeping alive the music that binds earth to sky." The chains that had held Galathan for so long began to crack, not from external force, but from their own internal contradiction. They had been forged in willing sacrifice, powered by guilt and shame. But as the Sky Lord's understanding of his own story changed, so too did the nature of his bonds. "The alliance was never broken," Galathan said, wonder creeping into his voice. "It was only sleeping, waiting for the moment when it would be needed again." With a sound like crystal bells ringing, the chains shattered completely, falling away like shadows before the dawn. Galathan stretched wings that had been folded for centuries, and though they were grey with age and scarred by long captivity, they caught the feather's light and reflected it back 100-fold. For the first time since the Sundering, the greatest of the Sky Lords was free. Section 9. Return to the Wise. The flight from the Sundering Halls to the Area of Winds was unlike anything Arion had ever experienced. Mounted upon Galathan's broad back, he soared through clouds and starlight, feeling the ancient majesty of the sky paths that had been hidden from earthbound eyes for so long. The Sky Lord's wings, though grey with captivity, still carried the memory of their former strength. Each beat lifted them higher toward the secret places where his people had withdrawn, to nurse their wounds and wait for the world's healing. The area itself was built into the peak of the highest mountain in the range, its spires and halls carved from living cloud and crystallized wind. Here dwelt the remnant of the Sky Lords, fewer now than in their glory days, for many had faded from grief or flown beyond the circles of the world entirely. But those who remained were still magnificent, still noble despite their sorrow. Windweaver the Wise stood first among them now, her silver feathers unmarked by age, her eyes holding the deep patience of one who has watched the turning of the world. When Galeathon alighted in the great hall with his earthbound passenger, her cry of joy and amazement rang from every crystal wall. "Brother of my heart," she sang in the sky speech, "we had thought you lost forever to the darkness. How do you come to us free and unbroken?" But even as the Sky Lords gathered to welcome their returned king, Arion could see the wariness in their eyes when they looked upon him. Too many earthbound folk had brought them grief. Too many promises had been broken for trust to come easily. Galathon saw this too, and his voice carried both sorrow and authority when he spoke. "My people, I know your hearts are guarded against hope, for hope has brought us pain before. But this one carries more than good intentions. He carries understanding." With reverent care, Arion drew forth the Feather of First Flight once more. Its light filled the great hall, and one by one, the Sky Lords began to remember what they had almost forgotten, that their withdrawal from the world's affairs had been meant as a temporary retreat, not a permanent exile. "The earthbound folk have not forgotten you," Arion said, his voice carrying clearly in the crystalline air. "They still look to the skies in times of trouble, still hope for the shadow of great wings. The children still tell stories of the Sky Lords who once guarded the world, and in their telling, the stories grow stronger, not weaker." Windweaver stepped forward, her movements graceful as falling snow. "Speak plainly, wizard. What is it you ask of us?" "I ask nothing," Arion replied. "I only bring news. The world turns toward darkness once again, not the crude evil of Morgast, but something subtler and more dangerous. A creeping shadow that turns friend against friend, that whispers that the great alliances of old were foolish dreams. The earthbound folk prepare for war, but they do not know who their true enemy is." Galeathon's eyes gleamed with understanding. "And you believe that our return to the world's affairs might help them see more clearly?" "I believe," Arion said carefully, "that some battles can only be won when the children of earth and sky fight as one. Not because either is weak alone, but because together they are something greater than the sum of their parts." The Sky Lords murmured among themselves in their musical language, and Arion caught fragments of their debate. Some voices spoke of duty and ancient oaths, others of the pain that involvement with earthbound affairs had brought them. But through it all, there was a note he had not expected to hear, a growing excitement, as if they were awakening from a long sleep. Finally, Windweaver spoke for them all. "We will consider your words, Arion the Grey, but know this. If we choose to spread our wings in the world's service once more, it will not be as we were before. We are changed, tempered by sorrow and loss. We will not again bind ourselves to the fates of kingdoms or kings. But perhaps," Galeathon added, his voice soft with new possibility, "we might once again bind ourselves to something greater, to the music itself, and to the part we are meant to play in its unfolding." Section 10. Stirring the North. From the area of winds, Arion's path led north to the ancient halls of Kazan-Kor, the mountain realm of the Stonebeards, a proud clan of craftsmen and warriors who had long memories and longer grudges. If the Sky Lords were to return to the world's affairs, they would need allies who understood the value of patience and the weight of the oaths. King Thorin's Stonebeard received the wizard in his great hall, beneath pillars carved from single gemstones and lit by the eternal flames that had burned in the mountain's heart since the world's making. The Dwarf Lord was ancient even by the standards of his long-lived people, his beard white as snow but his eyes still sharp as the axes his people forged. "So," Thorin rumbled, his voice like boulders grinding together, "the Grey Wanderer comes to my halls with tales of the sky folk stirring. And what business is that of the Stonebeards, I wonder? We who delve deep and care little for the affairs of the upper airs?" But Arion had not come unprepared. From his pack he drew forth a circlet of white gold, set with 7 stars of diamond that caught the firelight and threw it back in rainbow splendours. Thorin's eyes widened, for he recognised the workmanship. This was dwarf craft of the highest order, made in the days when his people and the Sky Lords had worked together on projects that married the best of earth and air. "The crown of 7 stars, Thorin breathed, but that was given to the Sky Lord Galathon at his wedding, as a symbol of the friendship between our peoples. How do you come to bear it?" "It was returned to me by Galeathon himself," Arion replied, "with a message. He remembers the craftsmanship of the Stonebeards and the loyalty that went into every hammer blow. He asks not for aid, but for forgiveness, for the long silence that followed the sundering, when grief made the sky folk forget their earthbound friends. The Dwarf King took the crown in his gnarled hands, turning it over and examining every detail with the eye of a master craftsman. "The work is as perfect as the day it was made," he murmured, "not a scratch upon it, though it has seen centuries pass. But more than that, it still holds the blessing we wove into the metal. The friendship runes still glow with their original light." Thorin's weathered face softened as memory stirred. "I was but a beardling when this was made, learning my first lessons at the forge. But I remember the Sky Lord who came to receive it, tall as a tower, proud as a mountain peak, but with eyes kind enough to notice a young dwarf trying to glimpse the ceremony. He spoke to me in our own tongue, praised the work of my grandfather's hands. There was no pride in him then, no sense that he was lowering himself to notice earthbound folk. There is no pride in him now," Arion assured the king, "only the wisdom that comes from great suffering and the hope that old friendships might be renewed." The hall had grown quiet around them, for the other dwarves had drawn close to listen. These were folk who valued loyalty above gold, who measured friendship not in words but in deeds performed across the long years. The return of the crown of 7 stars spoke to them in ways that no speech could match. "But why come to us?" asked Dane Ironfoot, Thorin's captain and heir. "The sky folk need no weapons from our forges, no armour from our smithies. What aid can we offer to those who ride the winds?" Arion smiled, for this was the question he had hoped to hear. "You can offer them what you have always offered, the strength that comes from deep roots, the stability that comes from stone and steel. The Sky Lords remember how to soar, but they have forgotten how to rest. They need places where their wings can fold, halls where their songs can echo from solid walls." He gestured to the great chamber around them, with its pillars that had stood unshaken since the world's making. "They need the friendship of folk who do not change with every wind, who honour their word across the centuries. Most of all, they need to remember that the greatest flights begin and end on solid ground." Thorin stood slowly, the crown of 7 stars still cradled in his hands. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of kingship and the warmth of genuine feeling. "Then let the ancient friendship be renewed. The halls of Khazan-Kor are open to the sky folk, as they were in the days of our grandfathers. Let them come when they will, rest when they must, and know that the Stonebeards remember their oaths." The cheer that rose from the assembled dwarves shook dust from the ancient rafters, and somewhere high above, carried by the mountain winds, came the answering cry of great wings. The first threads of the new alliance had been woven, as strong and true as dwarf steel, as enduring as the mountains themselves. Section 11. A Hobbit Remembered. The road south from Khazan-Kor wound through gentle hills and peaceful valleys, a welcome change from the stark grandeur of the mountain halls. Here, the very air seemed lighter, touched with the scent of pipeweed and fresh-baked bread, of flowers blooming in cottage gardens and streams running clear over smooth stones. This was the Shire, the green hills where the hobbit folk dwelt in their cosy holes, tending their gardens and living lives of quiet contentment that seemed untouched by the great affairs of the world. Yet Arion knew, as few others did, that it was often in such small places that the fate of great matters was decided. The hobbit he sought lived in a particularly fine hole called Bag End, built into the side of a hill overlooking the village of Hobbiton. The round green door was painted a cheerful yellow, and the brass handle gleamed as if it were polished daily. Smoke rose from the chimney in lazy spirals, and the garden was a riot of colours that made the heart glad to see. Bilbo Baggins answered the door himself, a hobbit of middle years with curly brown hair and bright eyes that held depths of experience unusual in one of his folk. He looked at the tall wizard on his doorstep with a mixture of welcome and wariness, as if he could not quite decide whether to invite him in for tea or to pretend he was not at home. "Arion the Grey," Bilbo said at last, stepping aside to let the wizard enter. "I wondered when you might come calling. The neighbours have been talking of strange lights in the sky, and great birds flying where no birds should be. I don't suppose you know anything about that." The interior of Bag End was everything a hobbit. Hole should be: round rooms with low ceilings, comfortable chairs by a crackling fire, shelves lined with books and curious objects from distant lands. But Arion's eyes were drawn to one item in particular, a small mithril shirt hanging in a place of honour, its silver links gleaming with inner light. "You've kept it well," the wizard observed. the gift of the dwarf lords, proof against blade and arrow, but also something more, a symbol of friendship between the great and small, the mighty and the humble. Bilbo's hand went unconsciously to his waistcoat pocket, where something made a small bulge against the fabric. Symbols have their place, he said carefully, but I've learned that the most important things are often the simplest. A good meal shared with friends, a story told by the fire, the knowledge that tomorrow will be much like today, with no great adventures to disturb the peace. Yet even as he spoke these words, there was something in the hobbit's eyes that belied them, a restlessness, a longing for distant horizons that no amount of comfortable domesticity could entirely quell. Arion settled into a chair that was almost too small for his tall frame, accepting the cup of tea that Bilbo offered with genuine gratitude. "Tell me," he said gently, "do you ever dream of great wings overhead? Of voices singing in languages older than kingdoms?" Bilbo was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against his teacup. When he spoke, his voice was soft with memory. "Sometimes, when the wind is from the east, I think I hear them. Songs that make my heart ache with longing for journeys I've never taken, for skies I've never seen. And sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, I dream that I'm flying, carried on wings not my own, seeing the world spread out below like a map made of starlight." "Those are not idle dreams," Arion said. "They are memories, passed down through the generations of your folk. For the hobbits are older than they remember, and their hearts still recall the days when they walked under the open sky, before they delved their holes and planted their gardens." The wizard leaned forward, his grey eyes intense with purpose. "The Sky Lords are stirring, Bilbo Baggins. The ancient alliance stirs to life once more, and I know that your people have a part to play in what is to come, not as warriors or kings, but as something far more precious, as the keepers of the hope, the guardians of simple joy in a world that grows daily darker." Bilbo set down his teacup with hands that were not quite steady. "You speak of great matters, wizard, but I am only one small hobbit in one small hole. What can I do to aid such mighty folk?" "You can remember," Arion replied simply. "Remember that courage comes in all sizes, that the smallest person can make the greatest difference. Remember that even in the darkest hour, there is still tea to be made, pipes to be smoked, stories to be told around the fire. The Sky Lords soar high and see far, but sometimes they forget the simple truth that hobbits hold in their hearts." As if in response to his words, a great shadow passed over the window, not threatening, but protective, like a blessing from the sky. Bilbo rose and went to look out, his eyes widening at the sight of the magnificent Sky Lord circling slowly overhead, its wings casting patterns of light and shadow on the green grass of the Shire. "Beautiful," the hobbit breathed, "and terrible in the old sense, full of wonder and power beyond imagining. But why does it watch over us?" "Because," Arion said, rising to stand beside him, "even the mightiest guardians need something to guard. And what is more worth protecting than this? Peace, contentment, the simple joy of a life well lived. The Sky Lords have remembered their purpose, Bilbo Baggins. They fly not for glory or conquest, but to ensure that places like the Shire endure, that hobbits may continue to tend their gardens and tell their tales in safety." Outside, the great bird gave one last cry, not fierce or wild, but gentle as a lullaby, before soaring away toward the distant mountains. And in its wake, the Shire seemed somehow more precious, more worth cherishing than it ever had before. Section 12. The plan set in motion. In the high halls of Erebor, where the lonely mountain stood proud against the eastern sky, a council was gathering unlike any seen since the days of legend. Dwarves in mail of bright steel stood alongside elves, whose cloaks seemed woven from twilight itself. Men from the lake town and the riverlands brought news of stirrings in the south, while from the Shire came a delegation of hobbits looking rather overwhelmed but determined to do their part. And above them all, perched on ledges carved into the great chamber's walls, sat the Sky Lords in their restored majesty. Galethan's presence dominated the gathering, but he was no longer alone. Windweaver the Wise had come, and with her Stormrider the Swift, Echo Song the Farseer, and a dozen others whose names were legend among the wind-touched peoples. Arion stood in the centre of the great circle, his staff planted firmly on the ancient stones, his his grey robes stirring in the draughts that flowed through the mountain halls. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly to every corner of the chamber, touching elf ear and dwarf heart, hobbit soul and skylord pride with equal force. "Friends of the free peoples," he began, "we gather in this place because the old alliances stir to life once more. Not from desperation, as in the dark days past, but from hope. Hope that the wounds of the sundering might heal, that earth and sky might remember their ancient harmony." He gestured to the assembled host, and the diverse folk seemed to shimmer in the torchlight like notes in a great song. "Each of you brings gifts that the others lack. The dwarves bring strength and craft, the skill to delve deep, and build to last. The elves bring wisdom and grace, the knowledge of things that fade and things that endure. The men bring courage and adaptability, the power to change and grow. The hobbits bring joy and resilience, the ability to find hope in the smallest things." His eyes lifted to the Skylords on their perches, and his voice grew deeper, more resonant. "And the children of the air bring perspective and protection, the ability to see the patterns that connect all things, to guard what is precious from threats that earthbound eyes cannot perceive." Galathan spread one great wing in acknowledgement, and when he spoke, his voice rang like silver bells in mountain wind. "The wizard speaks truly. We have dwelt apart too long, nursing our wounds and our pride. But isolation is not wisdom, and withdrawal is not strength. We offer our wings to this new alliance, not as overlords, but as partners." King Thorin rose from his throne of carved stone, the crown of 7 stars glinting on his brow. "The Stonebeards pledge their axes to this cause. Our halls are open, our forges burn bright. What is made in Kazankor shall serve the free peoples for as long as the mountains stand." Elrond half-elven stepped forward, his ageless face grave but not without hope. "The wisdom of Rivendell is yours to command. Our lawmasters shall search the ancient texts for knowledge that might aid your cause. Our healers shall tend the wounded, our musicians shall sing songs to lift the spirit." From among the men, Bard the bowman spoke with the practical voice of one who had faced dragons and lived to tell the tale. "Laketown and Dale stand ready. Our folk are few but determined. We know the cost of freedom, and we will pay it again if need be." And finally, to everyone's surprise, little Bilbo Baggins cleared his throat and spoke in a voice that was small but carried clearly through the great hall. "The Shire may seem a strange addition to such a grand alliance. We're not warriors or wizards, kings or lords, but we know something about endurance, about holding fast to what matters when the world grows dark. If hobbits can serve by simply being what we are, keepers of simple joy and quiet courage, then we offer ourselves gladly." Arion felt a stirring in his heart as the pledges were made, as if some great music were beginning to play once more after long silence. This was how the great alliances were born, not from treaties written on parchment, but from oaths spoken heart to heart, from the recognition that each people brought gifts that the others needed. But even as hope kindled in the chamber, he knew that darker forces were stirring in response. The shadow that sought to divide the free peoples would not stand idle while the old bonds were renewed. Already his far sight showed him armies gathering in distant lands, servants of evil preparing to test this new alliance before it could fully form. The real test lay ahead. But for now, in this moment, earth and sky were united once more, and the song of alliance rang from the lonely mountain to the ends of the world. Section 13. The fire awakens. Deep beneath the roots of the lonely mountain, in chambers that had lain silent since the world's making, something stirred that had slumbered for an age. The great worm Smaug the Golden, last of the fire drakes of the north, lifted his massive head from the bed of treasure on which he had lain, his eyes opening like coals suddenly fanned to flame. The dragon had felt it, the renewal of the ancient alliance, the joining of powers that had once been sundered. To mortal senses it might have seemed like hope rekindled, but to Smaug it was something else entirely, a threat to the long isolation that had kept him safe, a stirring of forces that might once again seek to bind the great creatures of the world to purposes not their own. His voice, when it came, was like the rumble of avalanches in the deep places of the earth. So, the little folk gather once more, dwarves and elves, men and sky children, all making their pretty speeches about alliance and hope. Do they think I sleep so soundly that I cannot hear their songs of war? The dragon's coils shifted among the gold, sending cascades of coins tumbling into the depths. Each movement was deliberate, calculated. Smaug was no mindless beast driven by instinct, but an ancient intelligence that had watched kingdoms rise and fall, that remembered the first wars between light and darkness. "I know you, Sky Lords," he continued, his words carrying through stone and air to the council chambers above. "I remember when your folk rode to war against my kind, when your songs of binding sought to chain us to your cause. You called it alliance then, but we knew it for what it was, slavery dressed in prettier words." The fire that had slumbered in his belly began to kindle, not with rage, but with something colder and more dangerous, calculation. For Smaug the Golden was perhaps the only creature in Middle-earth who remembered the true history of the last great alliance, who knew why the great dragons had withdrawn from the world's affairs. In the council chamber above, the assembled folk felt the mountain tremble beneath their feet. The dwarves reached instinctively for their weapons, while the Sky Lords mantled their wings in preparation for flight. But Arion raised his staff, and its light pulsed with calm authority. "Be at peace," he said, though his own heart was heavy with understanding. "The dragon wakes, but not to immediate attack. He seeks to test our resolve, to see if this new alliance will shatter at the first sign of opposition." Galathan's eyes flashed with old memory. Smaug chiefest and greatest of calamities. We had hoped, we had thought perhaps the ancient enmities might be forgotten. "No enmity is ever truly forgotten," Arion replied sadly. "But neither need it be forever renewed. The question is not whether Smaug remembers the old hurts, but whether we can show him a different path, one where great powers need not stand opposed, but might find common cause." From the depths came the dragon's laughter, rich and terrible as molten gold. "Common cause? What cause could unite the fire drakes with those who would cage us? What purpose could we serve but destruction?" It was Bilbo Baggins who answered, his small voice somehow carrying clearly through the mountain's heart. "The purpose of guardianship, great Smaug. The purpose of watching over what is precious, of ensuring that the small and defenceless may live in peace. Is that not what you do already, in your own fashion? Do you not guard your treasure, keep it safe from those who would steal or despoil it?" The silence that followed was profound, as if the very mountain held its breath. When Smaug spoke again, his voice held a note of surprise. "A hobbit speaks wisdom in the Dragon's Hall? How the world has changed in my slumber. Yet, yes, little burglar, I guard what is mine. But the treasure I protect is gold and gems, things of beauty but no life. What would you have me guard instead?" "The same thing we all guard," Bilbo replied with growing confidence. "The future. The possibility that tomorrow might be better than today. The hope that the small folk might continue to tend their gardens, that the great folk might find purposes worthy of their power." And in that moment something shifted in the foundations of the world. For the first time in an age, dragonfire kindled not for destruction, but for protection, not to burn, but to warm. The ancient enmity between Firedrake and Skylord began, just barely to crack, and through that crack, the light of new possibility began to shine. Section 14. A Blade Not Yet Drawn. While the council in Erebor sought to heal old wounds and forge new alliances, in the Southlands a different kind of gathering was taking place. In the shadow of the Black Tower of Gormund, where Morghast had once held court, new servants of darkness were rising to take their master's place. The Wraith Lord Khamûl, the Shadowborn, stood upon the highest battlement, his form wavering between substance and void, his crowned head turning this way and that as he tasted the winds of change. Unlike his fallen master, Khamûl was not driven by raw malice or the lust for domination. His was a colder evil, more subtle and perhaps more dangerous. "They think themselves clever," he said to his lieutenant, a creature that had once been mortal but was now something else entirely, part man, part shadow, part living hate. The Grey Wizard and his alliance of the willing. They speak of healing and hope, of binding together what was sundered, but they do not see the deeper truth. The lieutenant, whose name had been forgotten even by himself, bowed low. "What truth, my lord?" "That every alliance carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. Every friendship forged creates jealousies among those left out. Every oath sworn creates the possibility of betrayal. They seek to unite the free peoples, but in doing so, They will remind the world of all the reasons such unity failed before. Cumul gestured, and the air before them shimmered, showing images of the council in Erebor. But his scrying revealed not just the noble words and brave pledges, but the undercurrents of doubt and old grievance that flowed beneath them. The elves, for all their wisdom, could not entirely forget their sense of superiority over the shorter-lived races. The dwarves, for all their loyalty, still harboured resentment over ancient slights and unpaid debts. The men were brave but fractious, prone to quarrels over precedence and territory. Even the hobbits, innocent as they seemed, carried within their hearts the insularity that made them distrustful of outsiders. See how the Skylord's eyes flash when the Dwarf King speaks of old friendship. He remembers the price of that friendship, his beloved's capture, his own centuries of captivity. Trust may be renewed, but it is fragile as spun glass, easily shattered. The Wraithlord's plan was elegant in its simplicity. He would not attack the Alliance directly. That would only unite them more firmly against a common foe. Instead, he would work to exacerbate the tensions that already existed, to turn ally against ally through whispers and manipulations, false flags and carefully orchestrated misunderstandings. Already his agents were at work. In Lake Town, rumours spread that the dwarves planned to reclaim not just Erebor, but all the old territories, forcing the men from lands their families had held for generations. In the Elven halls, ancient texts were being discovered that spoke of Skylord arrogance and betrayal in the distant past. Among the Skylords themselves, voices whispered that the earthbound folk could never truly understand their perspective, that Alliance would only drag them down to the level of ground crawlers. Let them gather their armies, Cumul mused, watching as his dark servants flowed out from the tower like shadows at sunset. Let them make their brave speeches and forge their shining weapons. When the time comes for their first true test, they will find that their greatest enemy is not the forces arrayed against them, but the doubts and divisions within their own ranks. The Wraithlord's laughter was like the sound of wind through broken stones, empty and cold. For he understood what the Alliance did not, that the hardest battles are not fought against external foes, but against the darkness that lives in every heart, the selfishness and pride that can turn friend into enemy with a single poisoned word. But in his confidence, Cumul made the same mistake that had doomed his master before him. He underestimated the power of genuine love and sacrifice, the bonds that can withstand even the deepest treachery. He saw the cracks in the alliance, but not the gold that could fill them, the potential for renewal that lay hidden in every moment of doubt. The blade of division had been drawn, but it was not yet clear which side would prove sharper, the edge of suspicion and discord, or the steel of trust reforged in the fires of common purpose. Section 15. The Kingdom Reclaimed. The test of the new alliance came sooner than anyone had expected. Word reached Erebor of attacks on the outlying settlements, not the crude raids of orcs and goblins, but sophisticated strikes that bore the mark of planning and coordination. Farms burned, trade routes were severed, and always the attackers melted away before any organised response could be mounted. It was Windweaver the Wise who first perceived the pattern in the chaos. From her high perch in the mountain halls, her far-seeing eyes could trace the flow of violence across the landscape, and what she saw filled her with grim understanding. "This is not random destruction," she reported to the assembled council. "Each strike has been carefully chosen to inflame old grievances. The farm that burned belonged to men who had disputed water rights with the elves. The caravan that was ambushed carried goods that were meant as gifts between the dwarf holds and the human settlements. Our enemies seek not to destroy us directly, but to turn us against each other." Galathan mantled his wings in anger. "Then let us strike at the source. My people can trace these raiders to their lairs, wherever they may hide." But Arion raised his staff in caution. "That is precisely what they want, for us to react in haste and anger, to abandon the patient work of alliance building for the quick satisfaction of revenge. We must respond, yes, but wisely." The plan that emerged from their deliberations was unlike any military strategy seen in that age. Instead of armies marching to battle, the alliance would send mixed companies, dwarf and elf, man and hobbit, with skylords providing reconnaissance and support from above. Each group would be small enough to move swiftly and strike precisely, but diverse enough to represent the unity they sought to protect. Bilbo Baggins found himself assigned to a company led by Thorin Oakenshield, the dwarf prince whose own experience of exile and return made him uniquely suited to understand the complexities of reclamation. With them went Legolas Greenleaf of the Wood Elves, Bard the Bowman representing the men of Laketown, and high above, Stormrider the Swift maintaining watch from the clouds. Their target was the fortress of Razgoth, an ancient stronghold that had been thought abandoned for centuries, but now showed signs of new occupation. Intelligence suggested it was being used as a staging ground for the attacks, its halls filled with creatures of shadow and malice. The approach to Razgoth tested every aspect of the Alliance's strength. The dwarves' knowledge of mountain warfare proved invaluable in navigating the treacherous passes. The elves' stealth allowed them to scout the defences undetected. The men's adaptability helped them adjust their tactics as conditions changed. And the hobbits proved surprisingly useful in ways no one had anticipated. "You see, Master Baggins," Thorin explained as they crouched behind a rocky outcrop studying the fortress walls. "The problem is not getting in. My people built Razgoth in the old days, and I know every secret entrance. The problem is what we'll find once we're inside." Bilbo squinted at the dark walls, his sharp eyes picking out details that the others missed. "There," he said suddenly, pointing to what seemed like empty air. "Do you see how the shadows move strangely near that tower, and the way the birds avoid flying over that courtyard?" Legolas followed the hobbit's gaze, his own keen sight confirming what the smaller being had noticed. "Magic," he said grimly. "Dark sorcery woven into the very stones. No wonder our enemies chose this place. It amplifies their power while weakening ours." From above came Stormrider's cry, in the sky speech that few groundlings could understand. But Bilbo, who had spent long hours listening to the windsongs, caught the meaning. Armed figures moving through the halls, but in patterns that suggested not defence but ritual. Whatever the enemy planned, it was more than mere warfare. The assault, when it came, was swift and decisive. Dwarven axes broke through the outer defences while elven arrows silenced the sentries. Men followed close behind, their shields locked and their spears levelled. And through it all, the Skylords provided aerial support, their keen eyes spotting threats, and their powerful voices coordinating the attack. But it was Bilbo who struck the decisive blow. While his companions battled the fortress's defenders, the hobbit slipped through passages too small for larger folk, following his nose and his instincts to the heart of the dark magic. There, in a chamber carved with symbols that hurt to look upon, he found the Wraith Lord's lieutenant conducting a ritual that would have torn the Alliance apart from within. "I don't think so," Bilbo said politely, and threw his mother's best china teapot directly at the focal crystal that powered the spell. The explosion of released magic shattered more than just the ritual. It shattered the web of lies and suspicions that had been woven around the Alliance. Across the battlefield, dwarf and elf found themselves fighting side by side with perfect trust, their old grievances forgotten in the face of common purpose. When the sun set over the reclaimed fortress of Razgoth, the new alliance had passed its first great test. Not without cost. There were wounded to tend and dead to mourn, but with honour intact and bonds strengthened by shared struggle. The kingdom of trust had been reclaimed, one battle at a time. Section 16. A Ring Still. Sleeps in the quiet after victory as the wounded were tended and the dead were honoured. Arion the Grey stood alone upon the highest tower of Razgoth, gazing eastward toward lands shrouded in perpetual shadow. The immediate threat had been turned aside, the alliance had proven itself in battle, and the Free Peoples were more united than they had been in centuries. Yet the wizard's heart was heavy with knowledge that he could share with none of his companions, for his far sight had perceived something during the battle that chilled him to the bone, a stirring in the distant darkness, a malevolence so vast and ancient that it made Khamûl the Wraithlord seem like a mere shadow of true evil. The Dark Lord Sauron, master of all darkness, creator of the Rings of Power, had felt the renewal of the ancient alliance, and in his fortress of Barad-dûr, he was beginning to stir from the long sleep that had followed his defeat in the last alliance. The victory at Razgoth had been real, but it was also a prologue to a far greater story. "You feel it too," came a voice from behind him. Arion turned to see Galathan alighting on the tower's edge, his great form silhouetted against the star-swept sky. The Skylord's eyes held depths of knowledge that matched the wizard's own. "The ring," Arion said simply. It stirs in its hiding place. Soon it will call out to be found, and when that happens, the world will be plunged into war such as has not been seen since the Elder Days, Galeithan finished. I know, we all know, though we do not speak of it. The ring of power that rules all others cannot remain hidden forever, and when it emerges, it will test our alliance in ways that dwarf the challenges we have already faced. They stood in comfortable silence for a time, wizard and sky lord, both bearing burdens of knowledge that aged the spirit. Around them, the sounds of celebration rose from the fortress. Songs of victory, tales of heroism, the clinking of cups raised in toast to friendship renewed. But both knew that these joys were precious because they were fragile, moments of light in the gathering darkness. "Tell me truly," Galeithan said at last, "what are our chances when the final test comes? Can this alliance we have built survive the malice of the Dark Lord himself?" Arion was quiet for a long moment, weighing his words carefully. "I have seen many possible futures," he said finally. "In some, we triumph, but at costs that break the hearts of those who survive. In others, we fail, and darkness covers the world for ages uncounted. But in all of them, one truth remains constant, which is that the fate of Middle-earth will not be decided by the mighty or the powerful, by armies or magic or the strength of kings. It will be decided by the small choices of small people, by mercy shown when vengeance would be easier, by courage found in the humblest hearts, by the willingness of ordinary folk to bear burdens that would crush the proud." As if summoned by his words, footsteps echoed on the tower stairs. Bilbo Baggins emerged into the starlight, looking rather out of breath from the long climb but determined nonetheless. In his hand he carried a small object wrapped in silk, his contribution to the victory feast, a bottle of old Wynyard that he had been saving for a special occasion. "Thought you might like a drink," the hobbit said cheerfully, seemingly oblivious to the weight of the conversation he had interrupted. "Nothing like a good vintage to celebrate a good day's work." Galeithon looked down at the small figure with something approaching wonder. "Do you know, little burglar, what forces have been set in motion by our victory here? Do you understand what darkness stirs in response to the light we have kindled?" Bilbo considered this seriously, his head tilted to one side. "I expect there will be more troubles ahead," he said finally. "There always are, aren't there? But that's tomorrow's worry. Tonight we're alive, we're friends, and we have good wine to share. Seems to me that's worth celebrating, whatever may come." And in that simple wisdom, both wizard and skylord found a truth deeper than any prophecy. The future might hold darkness unimaginable, but the present held friendship, courage, and hope. And sometimes that was enough to light the way forward, one step at a time. High above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient courses, and somewhere in the far distance a ring of power pulsed with sleeping malice. But for now, in this moment, the alliance held firm, and the light of fellowship burned bright against the coming dark. The great song was not ended. Indeed, it had barely begun. But the first movement had been played, and it was good. Section 17. The Enemy Withdraws. The retreat from Razgoth was unlike any withdrawal in the annals of war. Cummal the Wraithlord did not flee in panic or rage, but with the cold calculation of a chess master sacrificing pieces for position. His forces melted away like shadows at dawn, leaving behind only empty halls and the lingering scent of malice. From the captured fortress, Arion watched the organised retreat through a scrying crystal taken from the enemy's own stores. What he saw confirmed his darkest fears. This had not been a defeat but a strategic repositioning, a gathering of scattered forces for some greater purpose. "They withdraw to the east," he reported to the assembled commanders, "beyond the Ash Mountains into lands where our sight cannot follow. But this is not the end of their threat. It is the beginning of something far more dangerous." Galeithan's great head turned toward the distant peaks, his eyes reflecting the firelight like mirrors. The ancient fortresses of Morgtul still stand in those lands. If Khamul has claimed them for his own, then he has access to weapons and artifacts that predate the rings of power themselves, Arion finished grimly. The tools of the first Dark Lord from the days when evil was young and crude but terribly strong. The victory celebration died away as the full implications became clear. They had won a battle, but in doing so they had revealed their strength to an enemy who was now retreating to gather forces beyond their reach. The alliance had passed its first test, but greater trials lay ahead. Thorin Stonebeard, his battle axe still stained with the dark ichor of Shadowspawn, voiced what all were thinking. So we have traded a visible enemy for an invisible one. The Wraithlord knows our capabilities now, our tactics, our weaknesses. He will not make the same mistakes twice. Nor will we, declared Legolas, his bow still strung and ready. We have learned much about fighting as one people rather than many. Our archery and your axes, dwarf friend, work well together. The men's shields guard our flanks while the Skylords watch from above. And Master Baggins, he smiled at the hobbit who was modestly trying to clean soot from his waistcoat, proved that the smallest warrior can strike the most telling blow. From the eastern battlements came Stormrider's cry, urgent and warning. The Skylord's message, translated by Galathan, brought grim news. Great movements in the Shadowlands. Not retreat, but consolidation. Something vast awakens in the deep places of Morgtul. Arion felt the weight of prophecy settling upon his shoulders like a cloak of lead. The patterns were becoming clear, the threads of fate weaving toward a conclusion he could glimpse but not yet fully comprehend. Camel's withdrawal was not weakness but preparation. Preparation for the awakening of his true master. "We have little time," the wizard said, his voice cutting through the murmurs of concern. "The enemy retreats now to positions of strength, to places where the very stones are poisoned with ancient malice. If we are to have any hope of standing against what comes, we must use this respite wisely." Bilbo, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly spoke up. "Forgive me for asking, but retreating to where exactly? I mean, if we know they're going somewhere specific, shouldn't we know what's there?" It was a simple question, the kind a hobbit might ask, but it cut to the heart of their strategic dilemma. Arion exchanged glances with Galathan, and in that look was a communication deeper than words. "There are places in the east," the wizard said carefully, "where the maps grow uncertain and the very air is poisoned with old evil. The strongholds of the first Dark Lord, built in the elder days when the world was young and malleable. We know of their existence, but their exact nature. That knowledge was lost when the last of the Elder sailed into the west. Then we must relearn it," said Elrond half-elven, who had remained silent until now. "My people's archives may hold clues, fragments of lore that seemed unimportant until now, and there are other sources, the deep memories of the Ents, the stone-carved histories of the Dwarf Lords, even the dream songs of the Skylords." Thus began what would be remembered as the Great Gathering of the Lore, as messengers flew to every corner of the free lands carrying requests for knowledge. Ancient texts were pulled from dusty shelves, old songs were sung by voices that had been silent for centuries, and gradually, piece by piece, a picture began to emerge of what lay hidden in the Shadowlands. But even as they worked to understand their enemy, that enemy was not idle. From Morgtul, tendrils of influence began to spread, not armies or raiders, but whispers and doubts, dreams that left the sleeper uneasy, shadows that moved just at the edge of vision. The war for the hearts and minds of the free peoples had begun, fought not with sword and spell, but with fear and despair. The Alliance had won its first battle, but the true war was only beginning, and in the growing darkness of the east, ancient powers stirred that had not walked the world since the mountains were young. Section 18. Hope in Ashes. 3 months after the victory at Razgoth, Arion the Grey stood once more in the sundering halls beneath Dol Morgul, but now he was not alone. With him came representatives of the renewed alliance, Galathan in his restored majesty, Thorin bearing the crown of 7 stars, Elrond with scrolls of ancient lore, and even little Bilbo with his practical wisdom and unquenchable curiosity. The halls that had once echoed with despair now rang with voices speaking of hope and renewal. The murals on the walls, so long depicting only tragedy and loss, seemed somehow different in the light of new understanding, not endings but transitions, moments of darkness that preceded the dawn. "It is strange," Galathan mused, his great talons clicking on the stone floor as he examined the artwork with fresh eyes. "How different these images appear when viewed not as records of failure, but as prophecies of redemption. See here, the chains that bound me were not permanent prisons but temporary tests. The tower that held Melania was not a tomb, but a place of waiting." From the shadows at the far end of the hall, a figure emerged that made them all fall silent. Princess Melania herself stepped into the light, and those centuries of captivity had left their mark upon her. She moved with the grace of one who had never truly been broken. Her eyes, when they met Galethan's, held depths of love that no darkness could touch. "My beloved," she said simply, and in those two words was contained all the joy and sorrow of the long years between. "I heard your voice calling, heard the songs of freedom that rose from these halls. How could I not come?" The reunion was brief but profound, watched in respectful silence by the Alliance members who understood they were witnessing something sacred. When Galethon and Melania embraced, when her small hands touched his great wing feathers and his voice sang the ancient wedding songs in the sky speech, it was as if the very foundations of the world shifted to accommodate the healing of this ancient wound. But how? Thorin asked, his practical dwarf mind needing to understand the mechanics of what he had witnessed. "The Tower of Dol Morgul still stands. The enchantments that bound you should have held." Melania smiled, and in that smile was wisdom earned through suffering. "Enchantments can only hold what chooses to be held. I remained in that tower not because I was bound, but because I chose to, because as long as the alliance was broken, my freedom would have been meaningless. But now..." She gestured to the diverse group around her. "Now there is something worth being free for." Bilbo, ever the practical hobbit, cleared his throat diffidently. "Begging your pardon, but if you've been free to leave all this time, why didn't you? I mean, surely love doesn't require suffering." It was Arion who answered, his voice gentle with understanding. "Because, my dear Bilbo, sometimes the greatest love requires the greatest sacrifice. Not the dramatic gesture of dying for another, but the quiet heroism of living for them, of enduring separation and sorrow, so that something greater might be preserved." "The Sky Lords withdrew from the world's affairs not because they ceased to care," Melania explained, "but because they cared too much. They knew that their intervention, however well meant, could become a crutch that weakened the earthbound peoples. We had to learn to stand on our own, to forge our own alliances and find our own strength." Galethan's voice rumbled with rueful wisdom. "And we had to learn that true guardianship sometimes means stepping back, allowing those we protect to face their own trials. The eagles who carry the storm must sometimes fold their wings and let the smaller birds learn to fly." As they spoke, the assembled company began to understand the deeper truth behind the Sky Lord's seeming abandonment. It had not been withdrawal born of pride or indifference, but a necessary step in the growth of the free peoples toward independence and self-reliance. "So the alliance was never truly broken," Elrond observed, his ageless eyes bright with comprehension. "It was only dormant, waiting for the moment when it could be renewed on terms of equality rather than dependence." "And that moment is now," Arion confirmed, looking around at the faces gathered in the ancient hall. "The darkness rises in the east greater than any we have faced, but we face it not as subjects seeking protection from mighty guardians, but as partners in a common cause, each bringing unique gifts to the battle ahead." From somewhere high above, carried on the mountain winds, came the sound of great wings and ancient songs. The Sky Lords were taking to the air once more, not as conquerors or overlords, but as brothers in arms to all who loved the light. The sundering was healed at last. The alliance was renewed, stronger for having been broken and mended, and in the growing darkness of the world, a new hope was kindled. Not the desperate hope of those who have no choice but to hope, but the confident hope of those who have seen love triumph over despair, unity overcome division. The song was not ended, would never be ended as long as there were voices to sing it. But this movement, at least, had found its resolution in harmony restored and love reclaimed. As they emerged from the halls into the clean mountain air, Bilbo looked back once at the entrance to that place of ancient sorrow and newfound joy. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I think this might be the beginning of a very great adventure indeed." And somewhere in the distance, carried on wings of storm and starlight, the great eagles soared through the brightening sky, ready once again to answer the call of those who fought for light in the gathering dark. The end here ends the song of the Wind Lords, but the greater song of which it forms but one movement plays on, through all the turnings of the world, wherever courage kindles and hope endures, wherever the small and great stand together against the darkness, and wherever love proves stronger than fear,